Hello everybody and welcome to another hobby cheating video, and today we're going to talk about working with your wet palette. So if you have already made the investment in a wet palette, good on you. You've done one of the best, cheapest things you can do to really improve your hobby life. We talk a lot about thinning your paints and stuff like that, working with your paints, and the reality is a wet palette is one of the best tools you can get. It's a minor investment, and it will completely change the way you hobby. It will make your life so much easier. If you're still using a dry palette in any way, I would tell you just give this a try, okay? Because this changed my life, hobby-wise. There's no simpler way to say it. Behind my airbrush, this is the second most important tool I own. Okay, so what do we have here first? Well, let's talk about the wet palette. So it's just a Masterson Stay Wet handy palette. You can get these off Amazon. They're pretty cheap. I think they're about between, basically $11 and $13, depending on when you order them, what kind of deals they have. That's US. I can't speak for around the world. When you get it, you get your little yellow sponge, and you get some sheets of paper. Now, the first thing I would recommend you do is take those pieces of paper that come with this wet palette and throw them in the garbage. They are useless for our purposes. They are made more for artist painting, for heavy body acrylics, or something larger. They tend to go fibrous and to break down and leave little tiny fibers in the paint, like very microfibers, which is irrelevant if you're talking about a canvas painting. You would never notice. But when it comes to a miniature and having, very exacting details with your glazes and stuff, you're going to notice. So that's number one. What do I use for my paper? Well, the answer is very simple. I use good old-fashioned Reynolds Kitchens genuine parchment paper. Love this stuff. And the reason I love this stuff is because, one, it's like this particular kind exactly here, which, again, you can get on Amazon. Comes with this little smart grid, which sounds silly, but it says makes cutting easy. Well, they're right, because I know exactly how many little squares are the size of my wet palette, so I can just pop it open, no need to measure, always cut the right size square out. It also tends to keep your paints the perfect amount of liquid. You can see here, so these paints most of these have been on here for, I don't know, about 48 to 60 hours, I think at this point. Probably, almost. 60's too many. Nope, probably about 60 hours. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, because I started this as I'm recording this. I'm just trying to think back. I put these on Tuesday to Wednesday. How about that? And this is currently, as I'm recording this, Saturday. However much time that is. As you can see, it keeps them pretty wet. Now, when you're working with the wet palette itself, you don't want a lot of standing water, but if you leave this open for a long time, it will tend to dry. The sponge doesn't quite fit side to side, so I keep a little water bottle like this next to my workstation, and what I will do is just kind of hit the edge of the sponge and just fill some water in there until I see water on the side, and then I'll just kind of tilt it back and forth from side to side, let the sponge soak it all up. Just back and forth, and I'm just letting the sponge soak in all that water. And I just kind of wet it slowly, and that keeps it nice and wet. When you close it, you're creating a more sealed environment. That will keep the paints nice and moist, like when it's closed. Keep in mind that, like, some part of them being under the hot lights of, like, my working lamps and stuff like that will somewhat still work against you. And if it's dry, like the winter, they will tend to dry out. The next thing I'll say is when we actually talk about working with the wet palette, you can see how I work here, okay? Like, you can see I have my colors, like what I've been doing in sort of this arrangement. But the way I tend to specifically work with it is like this. If I'm putting a new dab of color on my palette, okay? Like, I want to get some new white. So I'm just going to grab some Vallejo Game Color Dead White. I'm just going to go ahead and drop that on my palette in a space here. It can be next to the other stuff. If you push things really, really, really thin, like this, you will tend to see them kind of dry out. The paint staying together and in a little clump is what will keep it nice and wet and liquid. Like you can see that purple, that's been there for a while and that's still nice and liquid. So what I tend to recommend you do is with your wet brush, if I want to create a mixture, I'll grab some of my paint out of the main thing, pull it up here, and make a new area of it. And then if I wanted to do a black-white mix like I do here, right, I'll kind of get all that excess off, wipe on my paper towel over here, the side off camera. Then I go into my black over here, and I'm just going to kind of go down and back and create a nice little mixture. Now I'd probably do this with a little more paint if I was really planning on a big job. Then I'll go back into my white and I'll do the same thing from the other side. And so on and so forth, until I get a nice spread of the two colors. All right, so now what I've got is this wonderful gradient that I have set up. It's going to stay wet. It's going to stay ready. I can work with it. I can grab from anywhere in the gradient that I need. I can also easily pull in another color. Like if I wanted a little blue, I'll put a little blue above it, right? And then when I grab that color, I'll just pull it up and then pull the blue down into it. Okay? So I can gradient off that as well. Nice and easy. Again, if you pull these super thin like that, these will tend to dry out because the wet palette can only do so much. It's not sorcery. And very thin paint can get dry. The other thing I will say is, if you notice, it's probably slightly off camera, sorry, right here. What I do is I keep little drops of medium on my palette. So I'll keep little drops of retardant medium, glazed medium on my palette. And if I want to, what I'll do is just kind of go into that and work it in to the item directly if I want to make something that has that more in there, so I can get it nice and thin. Okay? So I can get it down into being just more of a filter. So I work it directly on there. I keep the medium ready to go on the palette in the same way. My general scheme is I have a little bit of retardant medium mixed with just a little bit of water and a little glaze medium. I'll also sometimes, if I want, do a drop of Flow Aid and just kind of keep some Flow Aid on the palette. It's clear. Flow Aid is completely clear, so it's harder to tell where you put it. It's easy to like lose track of it and then put a drop of paint down and be like, phew. So then it kind of goes. But you want to be careful with that. If you're trying to mix a large batch of a color, I recommend you have sort of, this is my older brush that's kind of fallen out of use. It doesn't have a sharp tip anymore. But in that regard, you want to mix up a lot of it. You want to get it together with your medium there and kind of on the palette in its own area. So that's where you can see here all this pink. That's what I did here. Like I still keep my main sort of center drop, but then I mixed a whole bunch of it out here because I knew I was going to be using a ton of pink for this project. Okay? The key is when you go back and forth, you can still grab a little more water and go in and start wetting up those paints a little more and get them flowing out there. You can always work it. The more you sort of push it down into the wet palette itself, the thinner it gets. And the reason for that is because water is wicking up through this paper into the paint itself. So the more you just literally kind of push it around, like I'm pushing down into the paper. Okay, the more you do that, the more you get a thinned, transparent paint. So often, just through the application of the wet palette itself, you can get very, very thin glaze consistencies. Again, I keep the medium there, you know, when I need to push it a little more, right? Or if I have tricky colors that don't like to glaze very well. But the idea is then what I have is a separate work area between my core paint And then my paint mixtures, whether it be like you can see all the places I've pulled this white into other stuff. Like here's my white pink, here's my white blue, here's my white green, right? In all these, here's my white black, my little steps of gray here. You can see where I've pulled this color up, but the original white still remained, untouched. I just added that one, but here was the old one. I got a little tiny touch of pink where I dipped my brush in there fast because I was in a hurry. But you can see how my core colors remain, clean, right? And so what I tend to do is work around the outside with the core colors and then mix in. My own personal hot take, you can do it whatever way is comfortable for you, obviously. The key is to make sure your sponge stays nice and wet. It should be shiny. You should have a little extra water on the sides in here. Make sure that you keep your paint, if you can, the more you keep your paint together in a little, clump, the more easy it will stay wet. You can tend to create a work area for your mixes and your active paints where you're working from. If you keep a little bottle of water or something next to you to keep everything re-wet, depending on how long you're going to have this open, you will notice that when you close it, your paints will re-wet because you're creating a more humid environment inside there where the water is going to wick up over time through it and it's not drying near as fast because the top's on. As for your paper, when to change it, I mean, these sheets will last you a long time, but a single roll of this Reynolds parchment paper, I mean, this will last like forever. I mean, one of these, the amount of space you have is generally going to last you a while. I change it once I don't have space to work anymore. It's that easy. And, in general, you'll get, depending on how heavy you paint, you'll get 6 months, a year more out of a single roll of parchment paper. And that's really the point. For basically $15, if you consider the parchment paper and the palette itself, you can completely change the way you hobby. This makes, when you create a new color, like this right here, this color was like 2 different pinks, a whole red, and a purple ink mixed to a very exact standard. Same with the one below it. It'd be very hard for me to keep those, to replicate that color. If I just mix it dry, I've got like 3 minutes of work time and then I'm done. Here, I can go around, my paint stay wet. I can work for hours with the exact same color of paint. I'm not going back to the pot. I'm not getting any new color out. I'm not remixing anything. It makes it faster. If your concern is you don't have enough time to hobby, you will be shocked how much time you gain using a wet palette when you don't need to constantly re-grab a pot, click it open, or grab a drip dropper, unscrew it, get the paint out, mix it again, get it watered, get it thin, start applying your paint. When you're just working constantly, you will be shocked how much different, how much faster you're able to work. So, there you go. That's my basic tips for working with your wet palette. I hope that helps. I hope that helps you use it better. Like I said, it's good to keep a couple mediums on there. You can mix things in as you go. I like retardant, glaze, and a little flow aid just to kind of get my paint working in the way I want it to. But other than that, that's using your wet palette. When I want to get things down, I'll show one more thing because this was a direct question I was asked. If I want to work to a glaze, let's take like this, let's take this blue and work it to a glaze. What I'll do is I'll grab a little of the blue and I'll put it out here and I'll push it around and push it around. And then I'll grab a little bit of water in it and I'll push it some more. Right? And you can see the difference there between the two of those. See how that one falls back and gets tighter? That tells me I'm still in a higher paint and medium situation than here where it stays more flat and out. That's because there's more water. That's how I know I've gotten closer to that glaze consistency. Okay? So you can even use it to test on here and understand the exact thickness of your paint when you see how it reacts with the capillary water of both what's in it and the palette itself and the material you're on. So, there you go. Hope that helps. I know this was a short and simple one, but hopefully it helps, inspires you to get a wet palette if you haven't tried it already, or helps you work better with the one you have now. As always, Thank you very much. Give this a like if you liked it. Subscribe for additional hobby cheating in the future. If you have a particular topic you'd like to see, just drop that down below. I always do love requests. Share this with somebody if you think they could use the information. Sharing is always the nicest thing you can do and deeply appreciated. And as always, we'll see you next time.